roll with the note taker giving the name last.
Ian.
Ian is speaking first, second is
Kieran.
Kieran. And then speaking third is
Rona.
Rona.
And then, note taker.
Marianne.
Cool. Opposition, first one speaking is?
Micah.
Second one speaking is?
Arson.
Arson. Third one speaking is?
Right.
Write-in, and the note taker is?
Erica.
Erica.
Alright, next please.
Do you have a filming pass too? A filming pass? Oh, perfect. Okay, so let's kick this off. So the debate will come to order. The resolution before the House today is, be it resolved that Canada stop providing investment incentives to all domestic and foreign companies operating in Canada. On behalf of the House, I would like to express a sincere welcome to our judges, Douglas, Amir, and Umar. Each speaker will deliver a 7-minute constructive speech. Either the first or second speaker of each team will also get a 4-minute reply speech. Points of information will be allowed during the constructive speeches only, but not during the first and last minute of the speeches. I will bang on the desk, as such, after the first minute, and again with 1 minute remaining to signal the duration at which points of information may be raised. For each speech, 15 seconds of grace time will be allowed for you to conclude your thoughts. After each speech, I will immediately call upon the next debater to begin their address. There will be no points of order or privilege. Heckling is also prohibited. Are there any questions regarding the rules? Right, good. At this point, we wish to remind all those in attendance that audience participation in the debate is prohibited. Light support is permitted in the parliamentary form of tapping on the tables as such. We remind spectators to keep the applause respectful so not as to interfere with the speeches. Any spectator deemed to be disruptive will be dealt with accordingly at the discretion of JDC West staff, with no warnings given. Please remain seated until the round has concluded and the competitors have exited the room. Do not use cell phones or electronic devices at any point during the debate, and please take the time now to ensure that they're on silent or turned off. Perfect. Okay. I will now call upon the Prime Minister to introduce the proposition for a period of 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Austerity hurts all of us. It's an interesting topic, actually. Our government has we've got a few key points here that I want to talk about, and it took a lot of thinking to really wrap our head around this resolution and what exactly we're talking about here today when we say that Canada should stop providing investment incentives to all domestic and foreign companies operating within Canada. So to start off with some definitions, investment incentives, as notified on the info slide, will include tax-based spending, program spending, and government business enterprises, as well as any other form of governmental support. We define domestic and foreign as both owned and operated, referencing to those companies. So before I get into our constructive, let me start you off with an analogy, just to put this argument in plain and simple terms. We're all familiar with the stereotype of the 30-year-old living at home in his mom's basement, eating Cheetos, playing video games, doesn't really want to do anything. Why is he still there? Why is he not out getting a job? Why is he not out being a productive member of society? It's because there's no incentive. There's no reason for him to be out there being competitive and getting stuff done because he's having everything paid for him. And there's equivalence on a Canadian-wide scale. I think Bombardier is probably our 30-year-old man living in the basement of Canada. A company that is not now profitable, has not been profitable in the past, and probably never will be profitable. And yet just last year, our federal government spent $500 million bailing out this company. And for what? No one is really quite certain. And with that, I'll get into our constructive. Our government's 3 points hinge on, first, removing these investment incentives forces companies to be competitive. And that's really quite key, as I just talked to you about. Second, the info slide, it says that these subsidies and other forms of government support cost the Canadian taxpayer for $14.6 billion annually. And that's something that could easily solve the budget deficit. So our second point then is this is money that could better be spent literally anywhere else from where it's being used. And third, more of a semantic than anything, the point is, how can we fairly choose where to provide investment incentives? What industries can we choose that's really fair, right? Is it going to be tech that's getting subsidies and investment incentives? Is it going to be oil and gas? There's too many to choose. Too many to choose. I personally will be taking this first point, and my colleagues will be addressing the second and third. So, I want to take you back to the early 1990s. And though tariffs aren't explicitly a form of government support, it ties in. It ties in terms of competitiveness. So before NAFTA was signed, the wine industry in this country produced really terrible wine. It was just like baby duck, like just the cheapest, like, you know, I could use unparliamentary language to describe it. It wasn't good. And signing NAFTA, all of the domestic wine producers were under the impression that their companies were going to go bankrupt, that they simply couldn't handle the influx of American wines and other cheaper wines from around the world, and yet they found a way. They found a way, and we produce some of the top quality wines in the world now, thriving industries that have more than tripled in size since this agreement has been signed, and it's because these companies have been forced to be competitive. And that's essentially what our argument hinges on. I'd like to summarize, though I haven't had much to say, as the argument is quite plain and simple to illustrate. Again, that being competitive is not something that can be achieved by giving subsidies. Being competitive is not something that can be achieved by telling companies, oh, it's fine, I'm sure you'll get there at one point. Air Canada is another great example, a company that's gone bankrupt that is required to be bailed out. And it's just simply not good for the taxpayer. My colleagues are going to talk to you in a few minutes about Amazon and other large tech companies and about austerity measures in particular. Cities across Canada, provincial and federal governments, have been offering incentives to these companies to build a new headquarters in their city. My colleague will be talking about the fact that there's no guarantee these companies are going to be here forever. And furthermore, the costs associated with setting up these companies that these cities, these provinces, these governments are offering are really just, yes, I'll take your question.
Does Side government not think that incentivizing foreign companies to invest actually increases competition?
To a degree, and promoting foreign investment doesn't have to be done by offering subsidies or investment incentives such as I explicitly laid out. You can quite simply have a lower income or corporate income tax regime than we have now. That would be an equally good way of sparking foreign investment rather than trying to bail out inefficient companies. There's dozens of other ways we can provide investment incentives that doesn't rely on hurting the Canadian taxpayer, because the truth is these big companies that aren't profitable, I'm sure at one point you'll go into it and suggest that they provide a large tax base, but if you're not making any money, you don't have any net income, you're not paying any income tax, and therefore you're not helping out the Canadian economy at all. Thank you.
From the opposition to the speech no longer than 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It may have taken Side government a while to figure out quite how they were going to debate this, and I understand that actually, because it really didn't take us long at all to realize how straightforward this is. It was ironic that their main point was that competition is good for our economy because I will also be talking about how competition is good for our economy. I simply believe that incentives for investment in Canada is a better way of doing it. Before I get into my main constructive points, I'd like to outline our burden of proofs, both for government and for opposition. So I believe that government needs to prove that not providing these investment incentives will actually result in more growth in the Canadian economy. And that for opposition, we need to argue that providing these investment incentives, as exist under the status quo, has and will continue to result in more growth in Canada. Before I get into my constructives, I'd like to do a little bit of rebuttal here. Again, I think that competition is absolutely the cornerstone of a market economy and a big part of what has allowed Canada to be so successful in the global scale. So I am not going to dispute any of those points. And in my constructives, I'll go into that a little bit. As for the $14.6 billion, I would just like to point out that Canada makes significant amounts of money because of these subsidies through businesses that are in Canada that wouldn't exist without that. And as for the how do we choose, I think it's fairly obvious that we choose which industries to subsidize based on where we are going to make the most money and what is going to be the most successful for Canada. I am going to be talking specifically about how incentives boost competition and boost investment in the Canadian economy. And then my second speaker will be going more specifically into the domestic as well as the international aspects of this. So I am very, very proud to be a Canadian. However, the fact is, there's about 37 million people that live in Canada. The US is a much, much larger market. India is a much, much larger market. China is an absolutely huge market. If you are deciding where to go, they also have lower tax rates in general than Canada does as well. If you are choosing which market to start a business in, Canada is probably not going to be your first choice if you're a foreign investor. Why would they come to Canada when they can go to these other countries where they have larger markets, again, with lower tax rates? The reason they do that under the status quo is because of these subsidies. I think the movie industry is an absolutely perfect example of this. In Vancouver, as well as Toronto, both have booming movie industries. The blockbuster movies are shot there all the time, and the reason for that is because they get massive tax breaks. These bring tons of jobs to Canada, that brings tons of money, and Canada is better as a whole because of this, Mr. Speaker. Would you not agree?
Does the member not think that maybe it's perhaps the value of our dollar being only 3/4 what the US dollar is that people are investing in the movie industry and other such industries in this country?
I think that there are a lot of reasons why people invest in them, but I think that the tax subsidies are a huge part of that. Anyways, so the status quo gives them an incentive. Side government would like to take this away. But under the status quo, there is more foreign investment. Here in Canada, our economy is increasing faster than our population is growing. In fact, our population, without immigration, without foreign investment, is actually going down. More people are retiring every year, vastly more people than are being born and are moving into the workforce here in Canada. I'll take your question in a minute. This means that not only is foreign investment good for Canada, it is absolutely essential. Would you not agree?
How is immigration in any way equivalent to foreign business investment?
I think that those two are very integrally related. Foreign business investment. So you spoke about operations as well as ownership in your model, and it seems to me that operation would certainly fall under that category. anyways, so that's sort of why foreign investment is so important. Domestic is also incredibly, incredibly important. So without these incentives to create jobs, people are going to leave. Brain drain is a huge issue in many, many countries, Mr. Speaker. We have an incredible education system that does an amazing job of teaching people really useful skills, but unfortunately, without incentives to work here, they're going to leave, Mr. Speaker. Certainly in rates higher than they do currently. We already don't have enough people here, so brain drain is an even bigger issue than it would be in other countries, for example, the US. I think that both of these points, foreign investment as well as domestic investment, that under the status quo, these incentives result in growth in Canada. The fact is that we are a developed country, but we have so much further to go. We have so much room, we have so much potential, and we are not even close to meeting it, Mr. Speaker. That is why we are incredibly proud to support this motion. I've talked about a general overview of why incentives increase investment and as well as competition. My second speaker will go a little bit further about domestic and international investment as well as competition. Thank you.
From the side to deliver speech to a lot of the sentiments.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, judges, and people in the audience. Thank you for being here. Today, we are talking about that Canada should stop providing incentives to all domestic and foreign companies operating in Canada. The opposition in their remarks stated that this their domestic aspects, but they more talked about the movie industry and how they get massive tax breaks than really relating this to the country itself. What we've seen is that many bigger nations, as they said, may have a better pull to bring trade in, such as China and the United States. But Canada, being part of the G7 summits, shows that Canada is one of the top 7 countries in the world for trade. And I would say that that would bring people in because we are very efficient at trading their own products. Now, when we talk about what my distinguished Prime Minister started talking about, he said that we would be talking about how the sum of money stated in the case was a very large sum. $14.6 billion is a very large amount of money. And this money can be used to solve a lot of different things. We primarily focused on federal budget deficit, perhaps, something that it could go to help our economy and help our nation. We see a lot of companies that have never been profitable, might never be profitable, and we keep putting money in and trying to bring them up when we could be investing it in a company that we know can go forward. Now, it's true, we don't have the ability to see in the future, but we do have the ability to see what is failing now, and we want to be able to take that failure and move on. Move on to something that won't be a failure, will be a success, and be a help to our country, not a detriment to it. Talking about a detriment to this, you can think of the word of insanity by using this idea. Insanity itself is doing something over and over again, hoping that you won't get the same result as you did last time. It's like beating a dead horse, except with this one, you're using the market. And I personally would rather not beat the market until it's dead. I believe that this market should be a free market, because a free market is a more efficient market. Yes, I'll take your question.
Canada's economy is growing exponentially. Could you explain how that relates to a dead horse?
Well, ironically, you actually said Canada has great possible growth, but has so much to improve upon earlier in your own statement. And I believe that is because we have so much to improve upon and that we haven't gotten there. It's because of the incentives we give now. And by getting away from the incentives, maybe we can change the insanity that we're already experiencing now. Maybe we can change to a more successful nation down the road, to answer your question. Now, to relate this $14.6 billion, we can talk about Air Canada and Bombardier. My distinguished Prime Minister talked about how Bombardier used $500 million. Oh wait, no. They wasted $500 million instead of using it for the betterment of them. And where do we see them now? They're a failure because we kept putting money into something that wasn't working. Why are we doing that? Why are we still doing that? We shouldn't be doing that at all. To move on to another topic, how can the government fairly choose where this $14.6 billion truly goes? You can't fairly choose where it goes. I can give it to any one of you and you'd be extremely happy, but what about the other 60 people in the room? I don't think that's fair at all. And I do not think it's fair that giving it to the people that we incentivize is fair either. We also see a lot of businesses that have thrived without incentives. The oil business in particular has been privatized, and the oil industry has never been more profitable. It is extremely impressive, the growth that we've seen, the jobs that have been given, and what this oil industry does for our nation. I'll take your question.
Are you aware that currently the price of oil in Alberta is lower than it ever has been?
I think it's a great question. 10 cents a liter, and it's because it's privatized, and because of that, it's able to sell at an extremely competitive price, helping our citizens as a whole over the nation. I myself am extremely happy with the price it is at, and I keep going to buy more because of it, which is really nice. Using on this same topic, we can talk about Amazon. Amazon came into Canada and was looking for a place to settle. A lot of cities, from Vancouver to Toronto, were giving more incentives to bring the company in, to build a big building, to raise big business, and to promote more jobs. And yes, this is a very good thing. This did or could have helped out. But there was no guarantee that they were going to stay. They could have stayed for 3, 5, 15 years. But after that, once they leave, what happens to this empty building? Will it get sold? What happens to the jobs? They're all gone now. What about using this money, instead of incentivizing Amazon to come to Canada, why not using a more idea of free market? Why not use the idea of a competitive market, competitive advantage to get there? And that, Mr. Speaker, is what we're hoping to show today through our government. Earlier, our Prime Minister talked about austerity. That's how we started out this, and that is what I would like to talk about to finish. Austerity, for the rest of you, is providing subsidies to spark investment. And in this topic, this is the measure of what this topic is about. And we do not think that incentives truly spark what we want to gain enough. It's not a big enough flame that we're lighting. We believe that a competitive market can light a bigger flame and keep it lasting for a longer time. And when we go through that, we want to see other things that have been talked about. I want to take a moment and just go back to what the Prime Minister said earlier. He spoke on immigration and how that was relevant to this, but gave no such example as to how it was relevant at all. He said, yes, it was. He said it was really relevant in his eyes, but he didn't specify how. And so it left me quite confused, to be honest. And then it moved from a movie industry to the immigration to brain drain. I was getting a little off track there. I didn't really understand where we were going. I thought we were talking about competitive advantage and the trade and how Canada is providing investments and incentives. We're a developing country, everybody. Canada is a developing country, and we believe that stopping incentives is a betterment to our society, a betterment to our country, than keeping them. I thank you very much.
I will now have the second speaker from SADA come and deliver a speech to allow the 7 minutes.
Globalization versus protectionism. That's a big topic that many people are debating these days. Mr. Speaker, I would like to start my speech with giving our team's constructives, and hopefully the other team can keep up with the points and furthermore understand what we're saying. I want to ask you a question. Which country you see these days that grow, in long term, they grow larger economically with being so close and being kind of supporting the protectionism idea. If you think about big markets like China, well, they did it for a few years, but now, recently, they realize they have to open up. Smaller countries like North Korea, Iran, and other Middle Eastern countries who didn't open up to international investment and even didn't support the domestic investment, they couldn't really keep up with the with growing the economy. I'll take your questions later. And also, before I start, I want to just clearly mention this, that we support both international and domestic support. Support, yeah. And we're just not focusing on one. We're focusing on both fairly. So why opening up internationally is good? I want to explain. I will give you some points. First of all, we need a bigger market. Canada has only, I think, around 30 million people, and the market is not big enough for even Canadian companies to survive. They need to go to bigger markets. They need to have a bigger market, and they also need to go to bigger markets. In order to move to bigger markets, the companies have to be stronger, they have to be more developed, they have to be more professional. And they were talking about the airline industry and how they waste money and they're not growing and stuff like that. Well, one of the biggest problems that Canada has right now is so many industries, they only have one or two companies running. They don't have competition. I know so many people, for example, for Canada Post. They call the Canada Post, they have problems, but they don't really care about the customer suggestions because they don't have any large competition. So in long term, sit down. In long term, they can grow bigger, and also they can survive in other countries too. So hopefully that will answer that question. And also, one more thing is that Canada is an individualist country. People need options here, and when you have more companies coming and you have more investment, you're giving people more options, and people here like it. That's why we have higher standard of living. That's why we're doing well. That's what Canada is. And with this, you can feed the people and what they like. And going to brain drain, that my first speaker was talking about it, and connecting it to immigration. When you have a more developed economy, there's more options, when there's a lot of companies, better trained and skilled workers will come to Canada, and they will help the industries to become better and to be able to compete with other companies, with foreign companies, with American companies. And in long term, that's how immigration helps Canada to become bigger in the economy and compete, basically. What do you agree?
If these large companies that we stated previously, that the member is talking about, such as Bombardier and Air Canada, are unprofitable now with the monopoly, how does the member see it possible that they could be more profitable with more competition?
Because if there's more competition, they would compete. They would want to try to compete and grow more. And in many countries, in many like U.S., China, that's how companies grow, and that's how companies become bigger and bigger and bigger. And you can see it now in China, how when they let American companies first come in, they grow bigger, and now they're starting to take over some of the markets all around the world, and not at this moment. So with all this point that I mentioned, hopefully the side opposition, Mr. Speaker, will know why supporting international investment will benefit Canadian people, Canadian economy, and Canadian society overall. My third speaker will go further with the will go further with the domestic aspect of it. And thank you for listening. That's it.
I call the third speaker from Side Government. Whoever speaks will get that.
Well, there were a bunch of arguments put forth by the opposition that I must say lack a lot of credibility and shows their overall understanding of what our arguments were in the first place. Well, let me begin by saying this. The government isn't exactly against immigration, which the opposition is somehow leading us into. We are totally not against immigration. In fact, Canada is one of the biggest hubs for immigrants in the first place. And yes, they bring in a lot of wealth, but we choose to not incentivize it, which is, in the end, the topic of this debate. We choose not to incentivize the overall investment that they bring in. Another point that I would like to talk about. In fact, it was supposed to be a question, but let's just say I was not allowed to do so. I'm going to talk about how the opposition basically used an anecdote of their friend calling Canada Post and just not being satisfied with their services. How is one anecdote representative of the experience of the entire population of Canada? I simply do not comprehend that argument in the first place. Yes, I'll take that question.
Mr. Speaker, does that government offer any other market where their motion would actually be helpful other than the airlines?
Yes, I'm very happy that you asked me that question. Yes, let's talk about the transportation industry. Greyhound just died recently. Greyhound is a company that everyone knew and now stopped working. But that did not stop other companies from starting their own low-cost transportation services. In fact, there's been an influx of several transportation companies that have already replaced Greyhound. So yes, and that happened without any incentivizing of investment in the first place. So that is already an example of how our argument is functioning in the first place. Now, the opposition talked about how subsidizing companies obviously allows them to grow. Well, we discussed this, and how is subsidizing any company ensuring the fact that it will give us future results? What we're saying is that choosing not to subsidize them entirely at least allows the free market to determine what happens to all these companies and allows them for growth. Don't you think that subsidizing and incentivizing things such as these would in fact be gambling with the taxpayers' money? I would like to repeat a statement that one of my colleagues mentioned, that removing investment incentives forces companies to be competitive. And I completely agree with that. And it seems that the opposition hasn't exactly disbarred it in any way. Another thing that I would like to talk about is SpaceX. SpaceX is a private company, a company that wasn't exactly incentivized in any way by the US government. And now, in fact, almost any government that actually uses, that requires any assistance when it comes to integral space travel, they employ the services of SpaceX. That did not happen because of any incentives by the government. That happened because the free market was allowed to fill a gap that needed to be filled. The opposition does not understand economics to its fullest. One of the most major points of economics in the first place is that the market is efficient.
My colleague talked about the definition of insanity. Insanity is repeating the same action and expecting a different result. But the fact that the opposition tries to bring up the same arguments over and over again to show that the fact that subsidies actually work, I think the audience can join the two dots. Now, let's talk about Bombardier and Air Canada again. These are companies that are unprofitable and will always be unprofitable. Why? Because they aren't structured properly. They aren't functioning properly, and they're relying on the government's assistance to function in the first place. The point is to remove such behavior. The point is to not allow this to happen in the first place by not providing any incentives at all. The entire argument comes down to this, that the market is, yeah, I'll take that question.
Does side government think a possible solution to the airline problem would be to incentivize foreign companies to come in and create more competition?
We believe that companies that the market needs to be filled, and that entrepreneurs, I believe in Canada's and the Canadian population's ability and their entrepreneurial ability to start enterprises that in itself allow such services to be rendered in the first place. Now, when we think about, let's say, Air India. Now, Air India was something that was started much earlier in the century and was a private organization, and it flourished. It flourished way better than after. It was originally called Tata Airlines, but then eventually it was nationalized, and then they turned it into Air India, which is now one of the most unprofitable airlines in the world. Now, that was a prime example of how taking over private activities resulted in extreme inefficiency. So, while there are no serious precedents, come to think of it, when it comes to the aerospace industry, I'm certain that there are far more precedents when it comes to how the free market has actually helped the overall ideology of the fact that everyone becomes far more efficient if the market forces are allowed to be on their own, and that is why our argument remains solid. Thank you so much.
And at this time, we will listen to the third opposition speaker. Speak for a time not exceeding 7 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, here is a simple example I'd love to give you. In neighborhood A, and there's neighborhood A